Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Coralville Public Library and the people of the city of Coralville, I'd like to welcome you here today to the culminating event of our 50th anniversary celebration. Today's program was made possible by the generous support of the Coralville Public Library Foundation and Prairie Lights Books. Thank you as well to the many staff and volunteers working today, and most of all, thanks to you all for your ongoing support of the Coralville Public Library. In a 2003 interview, Jane Smiley said, "When you are a medievalist, you don't study what's good, you study what's left. And you try to find good things in it. So you come to appreciate every fragment of every bit that's left and try to glean something from that fragment, whatever it is." In novels that span Greenland to horse tracks, 20th century Iowa farms to turn of the century San Francisco, horse races to history, Smiley has consistently looked for what is left, found the fragments, and built entire worlds from them. Though she was born in California, Smiley grew up, like many of us, in the Midwest. She was raised outside St. Louis, Missouri, and after a brief foray to the East Coast for college, she spent most of the next 2 decades studying and teaching in Iowa City and Ames, living often in the country, and at one point working at a stable in order to get a chance to ride for free. The Midwest she absorbed there shows up in many of her novels, most famously in 1,000 Acres, for which she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, but also in her first novel, Barn Blind, and in her brilliant satiric novel, Moo, and of course in the last 100 Years trilogy, which she'll be reading from today. Smiley earned an MFA, an MA and an MFA and a PhD from the University of Iowa and taught for many years at Iowa State University. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and a recipient of a Penn Lifetime Achievement Award for Literature. She now lives in Northern California. In an essay for the Writing University, Smiley said that living in Iowa taught her that you can make something of your circumstances even if they were not the circumstances you planned on, and that what you make of them in turn makes you. The fragments Smiley found through medieval studies, Old Norse, farm life, history, and so much more have shored up into over 20 books. From those works, we can glean much about family life, American and Scandinavian history, horses, human nature, and more. As we celebrate our golden anniversary at the Coralville Public Library, please help us welcome the author of Golden Age, Jane Smiley.
Hi, welcome. I hope I know some of you anyway. What I like to do with this book is to read a little, then take questions, then read a little, then take questions, and then read a little. Well, actually, there's a surprise ending, you'll find out. So what I decided to do since we're here in the vicinity of Iowa City was to read bits that take place in Iowa City or that are associated with Iowa City. So this is, for those of you who don't know anything about this, the Langdon family comes from somewhere in central Iowa. I'm not saying where. And there are 5 kids. The oldest one is Frank. He goes to Iowa State. The next one is Joe. He stays home on the farm. The next one is Lily, and she doesn't go to college. And then the fourth one is the bookish one. His name is Henry, and he goes to the University of Iowa. And so I'm going to read from year 1951. The trilogy moves year by year from 1920 to 2019. So I'm going to read a little bit from 1951 about Henry. Henry hadn't told Mama or Papa yet what he was majoring in. As far as they knew, he was going to be a doctor or a dentist, or he could go to Davenport and go to Palmer. See, that wouldn't get a laugh anywhere else. All Mama knew was that there wasn't a doctor within 30 miles of Denby who had any up-to-date training at all. So a bookish boy like Henry, who had lived for 18 years on a farm and still didn't know how to drive a tractor, could make himself more useful in some sort of medical profession, more than useful. But science did nothing for Henry. He had seen more fetal pigs in his day than any of the other biology students, and he had never seen one that he wanted to slit down the belly. He also had to go to the dental school and have 4 cavities filled by student dentists, one of whom talked incessantly while drilling, and then when the professor came over to inspect the fillings, he let out a little Henry knew that the student would be getting a D. But there was no offer to replace them. If Henry had felt any desire to take up dentistry, it vanished completely. Of course he liked his English literature class, and of course he wrote his papers with speed and enthusiasm. The first semester they read The Miller's Tale and The Wife of Bath's Tale, Every Man, Book 3 of Le Morte d'Arthur about Sir Lancelot, Dr. Faustus, Othello, King Lear, Twelfth Night, The Duchess of Malfi, 'Tis Pity She's a Whore, Pilgrim's Progress, and, in the last 2 weeks, the first half of Paradise Lost. Over Christmas break, he finished that and went on to Robinson Crusoe and Pamela. By the end of the year, they were to get to Oscar Wilde, which was fine with Henry. The real benefit of the class, though, was that he met Professor McGalliard. And now, in the second semester, he was having a private tutorial in Old English or Anglo-Saxon or whatever you wanted to call it. After Christmas, he had brought that stolen copy of Beowulf back to Iowa City with him, and he kept it under his mattress. He did not think his roommates would care if he had a book from the North Usherton High School library. Their room was decked with street signs, girls' underwear, ripped banners from other Big Ten schools. The Ohio State banner had been defaced in several ways, and even 2 hubcaps from a homecoming game against Northwestern. He got along with his roommates fine, but neither of them knew something that Henry was proud and fascinated to know, that foot had originated in the Caucasus as ped and was, of course, related to the Latin pes, pedis, the Greek pus, the Sanskrit pod, and the German Fuß, and that the P turned into an F by means of Grimm's law. Ball had originated as behel, meaning to swell, and was related not only, of course, to bellows, but also to follicle and phallus. The Grimm in question was Jacob Grimm himself, who was also responsible for Little Red Riding Hood and Clever Hans, those stories that in time-honored fashion his sister Lillian had only half remembered and so had told him in mixed-up and made-up versions. During one of their sessions, he related to Professor McGalliard the story of the Wolf Prince, his favorite. Professor McGalliard was kind and encouraging. He had gone to Harvard and seemed a bit perplexed about finding himself in Iowa City. He only let Henry do etymologies for part of the session. The first job was to learn to read basic texts like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles and the Seafarer. Beowulf was to be saved for next year when Henry had a better ear for the rhythm of the line. In the meantime, Henry was also taking German, and in the fall he was going to sign up for Latin. Eventually, there would be Greek, too, once he got hideous wastes of time out of the way like calculus and American history. You could only take medieval history as a junior, but there were plenty of books in the library that he could read on his own, such as Medieval Cities, Their Origins and the Revival of Trade, and A History of the Franks by Gregory of Tours. It was pretty clear that he was going to have to improve his French too, not because French itself was a language he was interested in, but because all of the best work was in French, Marc Bloch, that sort of thing. Professor McGalliard seemed rather amused at his enthusiasm, especially when Henry mentioned that he'd been raised on a farm. "I hardly ever went outside," said Henry to reassure him. But he just laughed at that. As for the other freshmen, Henry could not quite figure out why they were at college. His roommates, Forrest and Allen, were from Council Bluffs and Fort Dodge. They ate and slept Hawkeyes and were furious that the president of the university would not or could not hire a decent football coach. Iowa hadn't won the Big Ten title in 30 years. Henry was taller than Forrest and outweighed Allen by 15 pounds. Neither of them would ever play football, pace bahel, but they talked about it every day. Forrest thought he was going to major in business, and Allen had no idea. They slept through classes as a matter of course, talked about girls all the time, though they never actually talked to girls. As for girls, Henry liked girls well enough. Did he not get along perfectly well with Lillian and quite well with Claire? He knew how to talk to girls, and he often watched them. But college girls were not like girls he'd known before. The particular problem was one of vocal timbre. His skin prickled when they made certain squawking or screeching sounds, and in bars and in the commons, they seemed to make these sounds the majority of the time. He went out sometimes with girls who were a little calmer than most, but unfortunately, when they asked him what he was studying, he forgot and told them the truth. Inevitably, their jaws dropped, and that was the end of that. Henry didn't care. He told Mama and Lillian that he loved college, that he was perfectly happy with his part-time job reshelving books in the library, and that he was dating off and on. He did take a girl from Davenport to the Christmas dance, and they looked great in the photograph. He knew they were imagining a life that he was not living, but that was fine. There was a ghost in him that would someday emerge from those books that he could not yet read, and that, he knew, would be the real Henry Langdon. Thank you. So this bit is from 1982. So Janet is Frank's daughter. She was born in 1950. And she has grown up actually on the East Coast. But she ends up in Iowa City. And the reason she ends up, does anybody know how she ends up in Iowa City? One person knows. Should I tell? No, okay. She ends up in Iowa City for various dramatic reasons. And so this is 1982. Half asleep, Janet saw that face again, a black man in doctor's scrubs, striding down the hospital corridor, tossing off some medical terms as if he knew what they meant. She sat up with a cry and made Jared turn over, a cry that made Jared turn over and ask her what was going on. Was Emily okay? Janet said, "I'll see," and snaked out of bed, wide awake. Emily, of course, was fine. Janet stood in the darkness outside of Emily's room and tried to stop shaking. That it was Lucas was impossible. Lucas was dead. Even Marla agreed that he was dead. The worst part was that she could not remember which show it was. She'd been clicking through to MTV, hoping for a Pat Benatar or a Blondie video. Emily loved to dance around the living room to Heart of Glass. 2 days of exploring and she saw him again. He had a pretty good part on the soap, but not a lead. There was also a black nurse who would probably end up his girlfriend, but wasn't paying much attention to him yet. She gathered that Dr. Thompson was a new character. She wrote to Marla, but Marla knew nothing. In Paris, Marla had thought Janet and Lucas had both gone to, I'm not saying where. When she heard from Janet the first time, 2 years ago now, she was so happy to hear from her and that she was alive, but she wrote that she hadn't dared ask about Lucas because Janet hadn't mentioned him. Now that she was in New York, they wrote from time to time, but never about Lucas. What with Emily, and daycare and her own classes and Jared's schedule, she put it out of her mind because thank God he was alive. And once she got used to his being alive, well, why stir up old business? Curiosity killed the cat. That worked for exactly 1 month. Right before moving day, Solon to Iowa City, she was packing the books to give away, and out of one of them, the Bible, in fact, which was why she had never opened it after leaving San Francisco, fell a note. It read, "Too much is going on. I have to get out of here. I've got a possible gig at a recording studio in LA. I'm hitchhiking. I will call you when I can, Lucas." She turned the note over and turned it back. She smoothed it out. Why he had tucked it into the Bible, she had no idea, but she had given in to panic and let Aunt Eloise take her off to Iowa City. She knelt there for a moment, looking at the note, and imagined the phone ringing in her old room after her departure, or of Lucas getting that message, "The number you are trying to reach is not in service at this time." Not only was he not dead, she turned out to be the betrayer. Did he know that she was alive? It was entirely possible that he assumed she was the one to change her mind and go to. That he had read the newspapers horrified. Hadn't she, after all, been more accepting than Lucas had been? She perused the note several more times. It was dated, too. Friday, the night he never returned from the gig she thought he had. She stuck it in her sock drawer and left it there. But as she made scrambled eggs for Emily, it was Jared's late night, she kept jiggling her legs and walking around. When Emily wanted to go out onto the porch and work on the snowman she was building, Janet jumped about as if she were cold, though the weather was pleasant. When it was time for Emily to go to bed, she could hardly read the book. When Emily pointed out letters and even short words she recognized, Janet was too distracted to be enthusiastic. Janet kissed Emily goodnight, turned out the light, closed the door, and she went straight to her sock drawer, got out the note, and read it again. She would do nothing. Jared rented a truck. 7 of their friends turned out to help with the move. Everyone was a little excited. Janet and Jared were buying a house, the first in their group. It cost $55,000. The sellers were holding the mortgage and letting them pay 12%. The house was a brown house on Brown Street with screened-in porches front and back, 3 bedrooms upstairs, and a spacious, if not modern, kitchen. Janet and Jared had painfully come up with $10,000, and their mortgage payment would be $450 a month, which seemed huge, especially compared with their $160 rent in Solon. But the price of gas was $1.30 and didn't look like it was going down. Jared thought they could save $120 a month on his commute, not even counting the few occasions where they came into town to go to a movie or to the mill or to listen to music. Salt crunched under their feet, and Janet kept having to sweep it off the entry floor just inside the front door. Everything was out of the rental in an hour and 15 minutes. The guys drove off in a truck, and Janet, Leslie, and Gina cleaned. When the girls and Emily got to Brown Street, though, the former owners were sitting glumly on their own boxes. The driver of their moving van, which had the name of a religious organization painted along the side, had gotten lost in Illinois and then again in Iowa City. He and the 2 movers were too tired from their long trip to do anything. Jared and Janet and the 7 friends moved all the previous owner's furniture and boxes into the van while the movers looked on, and then Janet gave the movers 5 sandwiches she had made. She knew the look of their faces, the obedient look of people being given a new life. She wanted them to go away. When the owner thanked her and gave her a hug, she said, "Be careful, good luck, and I hope you get there." She put him out of her mind by focusing intently on everything she was doing, whether it was reading a book, listening to one of her professors, playing Legos with Emily, or chatting with Jared. She could feel herself getting louder, brighter, weirder, the way she always got when she was converting herself. As a result, she could sense Emily withdrawing, Jared looking at her sideways, her realism and naturalism professor watching for some other student's raised hand. Finally, one day when Jared was home with Emily and she was supposed to be going to class, she went to Student Health Services and talked to a Dr. Constance. She talked so fast that Dr. Constance stopped writing things down, had no opportunity to ask questions, just stared at her. She talked for exactly 45 minutes, thereby giving Dr. Constance 5 minutes to tell her what to do. The silence was total. Janet waited. Clearly, Dr. Constance had no idea either. The silence continued. There were 3 minutes left. Janet shifted her gaze from the woman's gray curls to the window and the brick wall outside and remembered how her own mother disappeared so often, heading out to see somebody. Dr. Dix, her father had called him. Dr. Constance said, I think maybe you should consider your marriage and your feelings for your husband. I consider my family all the time. No, I mean, ponder them, not take them into consideration. Whenever we are feeling something strongly, it is related to what is going on in the present. Janet said, okay, I guess now you're going to tell me to live in the moment and take things one day at a time. Well, it isn't bad advice. Janet looked at her watch. She really, really didn't want to be rude, so she smiled and said, well, anyway, thanks for listening to me, and I think that's a good idea. Then she ran. Yet another blizzard was in the offing. The snow already on the ground seemed to vaporize upward into the low-hanging clouds. She put on her gloves and pulled the hood of her down jacket over her head, snapped it closed over her chin and mouth. She stepped carefully around the puddles that were slickening as the afternoon cooled and darkened. She had almost done it, almost fallen right into the trap. It didn't matter, Janet thought, who they were or how well-meaning you might think they were. As soon as they started talking to you about your problems, their language captured you and put you in a prison of cause and effect, and you had to go along inside that, whether it was Oedipus complex or vitamin deficiency or admitting you were powerless or accepting Jesus, questing for a result that you could feel in yourself. The last thing Janet wanted in this life was to say, maybe I still love Lucas. He was beautiful, charismatic, fascinating, and for the person to whom she was saying this to reply, tell me about your father. She would, of course, reply, my father is an asshole. I wouldn't ask him for a penny. And she certainly did not want then to hear, define what you mean by asshole. She would be 32 this year. She had to accept the system that was herself. It had to move forward as well as it could. When she got home, sliding a little as she climbed the hill between Dubuque and Lynn, Emily was standing in the middle of the living room rug. Jared was sitting on the floor cross-legged in front of her, juggling 3 of her dolls and saying, look at them fly, Emmy, boom, up and over. Can I catch it? I can't catch it. Oh, I caught it. There goes another one. It was Janet who laughed, not Emily. Since they were going to be snowbound for another couple of days, she decided that that was enough for the time being. Then looking at the daughter who reminded her so much of herself, she thought, if I don't get over this by the 1st of April, we are getting a dog. She felt better at once. So, what time is it? Okay, let's have a few questions, and then I'll read from this one, and we'll see. So, a few questions. 1 or 2. If you have no questions, it can be about anything. I don't care. Yes.
Thank you for all the work that you've done. I did read the trilogy, the second book first, and then I had to go back to the first book to figure it out. There's a section where Arthur Brinks Manning is meeting Lillian. And he makes up all these wild stories about the buildings. I think it was in the small town.
Yeah.
Is that just a flight of imagination that you use? Where did that come from?
Yeah, it was just imagination. I didn't really expect Arthur to come into the picture. And then Lillian was working at the soda fountain. This is at right after the war. So Lillian is born in 26, so this is she's about 20 at this point. And Arthur is the stranger who comes to town. And he's very charming, and he's a good storyteller. He's good looking. And he whisks her away. And and then as soon as they get to where he's going, which is to Washington, she lets her mom know that she's been whisked away. Now, my mom and dad eloped, so we've all known a few elopers. I think it was more common in the old days. And I don't know why that was, but so Arthur's a made-up guy. But once he came in, I fell really in love with him, probably even more in love with him than Lillian. But because of who he works for, I had to torture him, so I did. Any more questions? Come on, yes.
What's your favorite thing about writing?
What's my favorite thing about writing? Well, it varies. Sometimes my favorite thing about it is finding things out. So you would do that, I would do that sort of before the writing, or pretty much before the writing started, but then going along too. So I come to a spot where I think, I don't know enough about this to go on here, so I need to go to Paris and research it. Or maybe just to the library. So I've always been a curious person. I was one of those kids who would be finally told to be quiet after she asked too many questions. And so I did, I love that part. But also feeling the characters come alive is probably another favorite thing of mine. In this case, because of the way I had kids, and the first one I had in Iowa City, the second one I had in Ames, and the third one I had in Ames. And when the doctors handed me number 2, I realized from moment 1 that she was completely different from number 1. And the books hadn't warned me about that. So I decided when I started this series that that's what I was going to do with my children, or my characters. I was going to start them out as babies, and they were going to be themselves from the first time we see them, and then they were going to go out in the world, and we were going to see how they addressed the issues that they found when they got, or the circumstances that they found when they got out into the world. And so that part was really fun for me too. What else do I like? I just like, and there's always the puzzle aspect of writing a novel. You set out, and it's going well, and then you get to the point where it doesn't make any sense, and so you have to sort out the puzzle and make it make sense. So those of you who have read my book, 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel, one of the things I talk about is plot. And plot is a system of logic that is the frame on which the book rests, on which the novel rests. And so it has to be logical, but it also has to have all these unexpected bits. And so making a plot work, I think, is a wonderful and intriguing puzzle-like thing. One time I was driving Mark Strand. Remember him? He was a poet. And he had just written he just published a book of poetry called Darker. And I was driving him from Ames to here because he was going to do a reading here. And we laughed all the way. And I had just written The Age of Grief, and he had just written Darker. And we were not depressed. And what that told me was that for us, the aspect, yes, there could be depressing content in our work, but the aspect of play was what kept us going. And so I think that's, for a novel or a poem or a play or any piece of art, that's what the artist is interested in, is that aspect of play and that puzzle-like thing. Yes.
What percentage of the time would you say you go to sleep and or wake up thinking about your characters? And have you ever had a sense that your husbands or children have been jealous of your characters? They're so real to you, obviously.
What percentage of the time do I go to sleep or wake up thinking about my characters, and are my relatives jealous of my characters? I would say no to the second part because they know what side their bread is buttered on. So if they are jealous, they keep it to themselves. My current husband knows that he's the inspiration for a lot of my work. And almost the only time I'm ever annoyed with him is when he tells me something that happened to him or that he heard long, long ago that he forgot to tell me until now, and so I didn't get to put it into a book yet. I try to be done writing by 4 o'clock in the evening. I don't want to think about it in the night. What my favorite thing to do is, if I get stuck, I'll go ride a horse. And almost invariably, as I'm tacking up or doing something with one of the horses, some solution comes to me. And I try very, very hard to keep that in mind until I get home. I'm a big believer in that theory of creativity that you work, and then you back off. And then your brain does something to prune the bad ideas and to maintain the good ideas. And that's pretty much worked for me. I also am a big believer in not judging your own work while you're doing it, or ever if you can, because you're not the best judge of it. Other people, your temperament is going to tell you how to judge it. And if you're a perfectionist, your temperament is going to tell you always, this is terrible, this is terrible, this is terrible. It's better to be someone like Dickens or Trollope, who really embraces the work while it's going on and then puts it away. So at least that's been my experience. Okay, one more. Yes, back there.
You talked about the framework of the plot. For all 3 books, did you have it all laid out before you wrote the first one? How did the plot develop over 3 books?
Did I have the plot worked out before I wrote? No, I didn't. I knew it was going to start in 1920, so therefore, if it was going to be called The Last 100 Years, it had to end in 2019. I could add that, well, not much better, though. And I knew I was going to weave I knew that each year was going to go year by year, and I knew that I was going to weave the lives of the characters into the year. I'd had a little bit of practice with this kind of structure when I wrote Moo, because I had a bunch of characters and I had a chart, and across the top it had the name of the characters, and down the side it had the year, it had the chapter numbers. And so as I put a character in a chapter, I would check that space. And so then I could see whether the characters were getting lost or not. So I'd had a little bit of practice at that. So what I would do is I'd say to myself, okay, it's 1992, here's what's going on, who's more likely to have it, and here's so-and-so, he's this old, is he more likely, where is he most likely to be, and should we follow him? And so I kept doing that, and then in various drafts I would take out or I would add little bits. But I really wanted, so I don't see it as having too much of a plot, but as the characters went forward, and I saw where the conflicts lay, I sort of shaped the plot around those characters, which meant that I had to let some characters go off the stage that I was sorry to see go. But that didn't mean I killed them all. I killed a lot of them. It was fun. Yes, back there.
Surprised at where your characters ended up, that maybe they ended up somewhere totally different.
Absolutely. It's too bad I can't, I was surprised at where they ended up. But what I had to do was they would be somewhere, and then I would think, okay, given where the other various relatives are, what's the likely thing for them? What's the likely place for them to go? Now, the most adventurous one was Frank. The one who stayed home on the farm was Joe. And so where Frank ended up was where he ended up after heading out. Where Joe ended up was what the circumstances of farming made of him. And so the reasons that they ended up in certain mental states or in certain places were always different. But it was interesting to me to follow them where they went. And so sometimes I was surprised. Sometimes I was surprised. I do have to tell you that after I finished volume 3, and I had done several rewrites, sometime in the spring, I sent my editor an email that said, "Oh my God, I forgot to kill Lois." And then I was terrified that some NSA peeking at my emails would think I was a mass murderer. So you'll have to see what I finally decided for Lois. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit from Golden Age. This is about Henry. So Henry, this is 1996, and (1996). So Henry, who was born in 1932, is 64, and he's been teaching at Northwestern. He got a good teaching job thanks to Professor McGallard, who was my professor at the University of Iowa for Old Norse. 1996. The only difference that Henry could perceive between his former self and his present self was that he could not stand the cold anymore. A week after his 63rd birthday last October, perfectly aware of what happened to Frank, who was 74 and who had been unique in many ways, Henry had gone to his doctor and asked for a full workup. He was not one of those old men who dressed carefully in the morning in classic styles, who shaved twice a day, who got $100 haircuts to make the best of the bald pate, and then, when passing a plate glass window, noticed that the hems of his trousers were above his ankle bones. When Henry passed a plate glass window, he recognized his perennial self, trim, clean, coordinated, up to date. The doctor had told him after 2 days of tests that appearances were not deceiving. His blood pressure was 110/62, his lungs were clear, and his heartbeat was regular. His reflexes were normal, his PSA was between 3 and 4, and his prostate was lump-free. He had good circulation in his toes. His LDL was 115, his HDL 62, his triglycerides 145, his blood type was O negative, his height was 6 feet and a half inch, and his weight 158. But winter bore down upon him like an Arctic blast. When his students were showing up for class in sweaters, he was wearing a down coat. When they donned ski jackets, scarves, and mittens, Henry wore all of the above, plus long underwear and thermal socks from Land's End. His boots were insulated, and he had the heat in his place up to 78. Claire and Carl couldn't stand to come over and didn't dare invite him to their place. The most unfortunate result was that he completely lost interest in everything he had ever loved. He could not teach his Old English students the wanderer, much less the seafarer. Beowulf made him shake in his boots. not because Grendel was a monster, but because the mead hall was freezing and Wealhtheow was wearing a dress. Norse literature was out of the question. He did not want to read the usual passages of Grettir's saga, not because Grettir cut off several heads, but because he threw off his clothes and swam out into the winter ocean. Even the Song of Roland, or the Song of Roland, was difficult because Roncesvalles Pass was at 3,000 feet, windswept and barren. He didn't mind Orlando Furioso because Ariosto did not successfully imagine snow and cold, but they wouldn't be getting to that until spring. He was almost finished with his book of essays about Gerald of Wales, but he set it aside, not wanting to imagine St. David's thrusting like a thumb into the North Atlantic. Toulouse was not warm enough. Béziers was not warm enough. Rome was not warm enough. And he was too much of a tightwad to make last-minute reservations for St. Thomas, too much of a snob to go to Miami, too unimaginative to go to Maui, where it turned out Miles, the guy who had the office next to his, went for 2 weeks, even though his specialty was the Victorian novel. He told Henry that they went to Hawaii every year. Why go to London? They could do that in the summer. How stupid was I, thought Henry, that I have spent every vacation of my entire life doing homework. And he discovered you could lie in your bed under your flannel sheets and 2 down comforters and pajamas with socks, your hands under the small of your back, a pillow over your face, and still feel the chill creeping over and around your shoulders and neck and the arches of your feet, across your belly, into your nostrils. You could decide very rationally that you were crazy, that the cold was something you were emanating rather than experiencing. You could sit up and take your temperature and read that it was 98.8 and still shiver. It was better to be one of those manic women who threw off all their clothes and ran naked into the street. At least they were expanding rather than shrinking. To be freezing yourself to death was embarrassing by contrast. However, it was not as though Henry didn't know Freud had existed, or Jung, or Adler, or Beck. He had read Freud's case studies of the Wolfman and Little Hans, though he didn't have them on his shelves. He had read The Undiscovered Self and Man and His Symbols, but had tossed them, thinking that Jung's take on literature was imprecise. There was, in fact, no book on his shelves that could help him. He had read too much, had grown too self-confident. And so he bundled up, went to the college bookstore, and bought a book about freezing to death, then read it under the covers by flashlight. How did you revive someone whose body temperature had dropped below 85 degrees? Dry clothing, gradual warmth. He was sorry to discover that the old technique Frank had told him about, putting the chilled one in a sleeping bag with a warm, naked person, could not work because the chilled person would sweat and get colder. What you must not do under any circumstances was put the chilled person in a hot bath, which could cause sudden dilation of the circulatory system and probably a heart attack. And so Henry crept to his bedroom as across frozen tundra, turned on the hot water, waited until the tub was 3/4 full, shrugged off his layers of clothes and slipped in, something he hadn't done for years, since he preferred to shower. Possibly, he felt a distinct contrast between his core temperature cold and his peripheral temperature hot, but possibly he was simply remembering the time his colleague Marie, who taught structural linguistics, told him about taking a long walk and getting so cold that she had this very feeling. His problem was that he remembered everything, wasn't it? His mind was a library of images and interpretations, none of which helped him get over his lifelong solitude. Or perhaps his problem was that when Marie had told him this story, a little excited and scared, he had been less than sympathetic. He stood still for a moment and said, how peculiar, and then continued into his office, closing the door in her face. He had been preoccupied with something. In faculty meetings, he eavesdropped with a superior look on his face, but did not contribute. When Harold, the chairman, Irish Renaissance, specialty J.M. Singh, called the meeting to order, Henry would give his report on budgeting, faculty salaries, potential new hires, take questions, then sit back and ignore the rest of the meeting. For years, he had taken an interest in students, quite an interest, in fact, though nothing sleazy, he told himself. But then Ralph Markson, Keats, Shelley, was fired for sleeping with 2 young women and raising their grades. The policy that forbade this was not new, but the department came to realize it had to be enforced. Henry retreated immediately, stopped closing the door when students came for conferences, stopped even looking directly at his students when they spoke in class. He had always called them Miss So-and-so and Mr. So-and-so, but now he avoided even learning their given names. He was invited to the departmental Christmas party and the departmental Labor Day party, but he knew, and everyone else knew, that they didn't care for children, that he didn't care for children, and so he was left quietly in some corner or other, self-satisfied and neat. Claire had moved out the year before. Joe was now ill with something undefined but debilitating. Lillian was long gone. Arthur was alive, but to hear Andy tell it, he was more or less mummified in the chill of Hamilton, New York. Better not to think of that. Henry slid down in the bathtub and turned the hot water on again with his toe. He was about to be the oldest something or other in his family, in his department, in his tiny world. He had nothing to offer and no experience with offering. So that's what happens when you go to the University of Iowa. So be warned. Okay, so we have time for a few more questions. Yeah.
How did you find out that you won the Pulitzer Prize, and what was your reaction?
I'm surprised. I've told this story so many times. I'm almost ashamed to tell it anymore, but I was living in Ames, and I'd been on the phone with the New York Times book review because I was doing a review, I think. And then I hung up. My daughter was home from school. She was 14. Yeah, she was 14, or 13 or 14. And the phone rang, and the guy on the other end of the line said, "Did you hear anything from New York?" I said, "No." He said, "Okay. Did you hear anything about the Pulitzer Prize?" I said, "No." He said, "Okay. All right. If it were to turn out that you had won the Pulitzer Prize, what would you say?" So I said something. And then I went over and I sat down at the breakfast table and I said, "Honey, I think I won the Pulitzer Prize." And she said, "Huh." So then I went to school, and I had an afternoon class to teach, and exactly at 2 o'clock, the phone started ringing, because that's when information went out over the wires. So it was a phone in my office in Ames. And I started picking the phone up and talking to people, and they would ask me what I thought. And then I heard screaming. And so I got up and I went and opened the door, and here came the girl or the young woman who was the Ames stringer for the Des Moines Register, and she was holding the Ames Tribune in her hand, and she realized she had been scooped. And she was mad. So apparently what happened was the guy who actually was in TV journalism, I'd never heard of him before, but he happened to own the Ames Tribune, and he was not on the judging board, but he was sort of the boss of all of them. So when he found out, he told the Ames Tribune, and they scooped the Des Moines Register. Not easy. Okay, I think one more. Yes, back there, and then here.
So getting to practice some luck, you have some chapters starting with infant Frank, infant Joey,
Uh-huh.
pre-verbal infant. How did you do that? Did you do research?
How did I write about pre-verbal infants? Well, excuse me. I did research. There are plenty of books now about of research into how infant brains work. And then also because I had kids of my own, I observed. and I sort of watched them, and the way, one of my favorite memories is when my daughter Lucy, who went to school at Iowa City too, when she was about 8 months old, now I'm going to tell a different story. We were living in Ames, and she was about 2.5, I guess, because it was the spring. She talked to herself all the time, and even when she was 8 months old, she was blah, 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 blah. And so I was looking out the window of my house, and she was out standing by a tree, and I could hear out the window that she was talking, and I heard her say, "Mom, Mom, Mom." And so I went outside, and I said, "Do you need me?" And she said, "No, go back in-house." And so just to watch her and to watch the other ones and to see how they related to one another and to imagine why they were doing certain things, I thought that was good research too. So I've always been interested, because I have kids, I always was interested in kids. One time when I first got to Ames, I was teaching summer school, and I was walking across the campus, and I think I was 7 months pregnant, so I wasn't walking very fast. But I remember wondering if I could ever write anything again, because I hadn't read any books by women with children. And so I wrote an essay about it called "Can Mothers Think?" But I found writing to be really, my writing was really enriched and made much more enjoyable by spying on the children. Did someone up here have one? No? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. Good questions. Thank you very much.
You're all invited to the Rotunda area. We have a reception. Prairie Lights is there selling books. Jane Smiley will be there signing books. So there's refreshments from Brick's restaurant in Iowa City, and wine, and this is compliments of the Coralville Public Library Foundation. So please join us and take the time to chat with Ms. Smiley. Thank you.